Power Rangers Time Force, released in 2001 for the PlayStation, and based on that year's particular incarnation of Power Rangers, which quite a few fans hold in some high regard due to its more serious tone or something to that extent. There's also a Game Boy Advance game that was previously reviewed. Long story short, it's not very good. And also there was a Game Boy Color game that I've got lying around somewhere. One of these days we'll get around to that one, but for now, let's look at this PlayStation game. So this game has you taking control of the Time Force Rangers from the future to apprehend the criminal Rancic and his band of mutants who have escaped to this past to do evil stuff and stuff. However, unlike the series where they spend the better part of the series fighting in the present day with only fleeting moments of time travel, Time Force the video game actually has some time travel involved. So aside from Silver Hills in 2001, which serves as your tutorial level and potential extra lives farm, you'll also be venturing in the Old West, prehistoric times, Roman times, and even the future. Ooh, God, this looks dreadful. Right, so each level has you picking any of the core 5 Time Force Rangers at your disposal, and from there you navigate the level from point A to point B, whatever that entails. Some levels are somewhat of a straightforward affair, other levels have you collecting a number of key items to shut down some force field or open up a door. Some levels have you looking for switches and levers to operate doors or manipulate the level in some fashion, but at the end of the day, the overall objective remains the same. Make your way to the end of the level where you fight off the main boss, defeat him or her, and summon your Megazord, which comes in 3 varieties but otherwise play the same, to put him or her on ice once and for all. Pretty straightforward stuff all around. In addition to the standard go through the level and beat the boss to move on to the next level stuff, Time Force tosses in a couple additional bonus objectives. As you see above, you have a timer counting down. Good news, when the timer hits 0, the game doesn't end, it'll just continue counting in the negatives. However, if you manage to complete the level before the timer hits 0, then you'll get a nice little health extension which allows you to last a little longer in a level. Naturally, the best means of speeding through a level is avoiding all the needless combat and just make your runs while collecting hourglass icons to add time. I suppose one could complain about the speedrunning aspect making fighting enemies worthless, but believe me, unless it's a boss, fighting just about anyone in this game is pretty worthless, and you're just better off making a run for it without lifting a finger. Go pacifist ranger, if you will. Aside from that, each area has a timeline artifact that can be found and collected if you're so inclined. There's 1 artifact per level, and if you manage to collect all 7 artifacts, you'll unlock the Quantum Ranger, who naturally has the best stats in the game, and is only available when the whole game is already cleared and nothing else matters. So that's pretty much a waste of time, but hey, look on the bright side. You could pick him as a separate character, he's not just a power-up like in the GBA version. Unfortunately, there's no Q-Rex to play around with here, and par for the course, all 6 Rangers pretty much play the same way outside of some minor stat differences, which is negligible at best. Also, unlike the GBA version, you don't have any weapons on hands. No chrono blasters or vector weapons to be found here, just the moves you'll learn in the training missions. Did I mention the training missions? Yeah, let's touch on that briefly. In between time zones, you'll participate in training sessions that will enable and introduce some new ability to your arsenal, whether it be a ground pound or overhead stun ball or whatever the case may be. These abilities can be used to either uncover new areas or get an upper hand against enemies, provided you have enough energy to pull it off. Energy can be restored by standing on these platforms, with silvery blue platforms allowing for infinite regenerations, while red platforms only providing a minor energy boost before being rendered useless. The problem with these abilities is that if you go back to an earlier level because you want to try and clear the stage quicker or find the artifact for that level, the more advanced moves won't carry over to the older levels and you're basically reset to your underdeveloped moveset as if you were playing that level for the first time. Just to give you a quick example, at a later point in the game you'll gain an arcing fireball attack that allows you to damage enemies at a distance. However, if you enter an earlier level such as the Old West level, you won't have that fireball ability, only the ground pound attack that you've learned after beating the first level in Silver Hills. It's too bad though, because some of the more advanced moves like the tornado spin could be useful in earlier levels, and it certainly wouldn't have hurt to design these levels in a way that you could only reach a certain point with a more advanced ability, but sadly, it's not to be. Of course, that sort of forward thinking would have been something you'd find in something resembling a good game, but not Time Force, oh noes. Despite its somewhat meaty potential, the game is hampered by gameplay that is snore-inducing at best, irritable at worst, and quite frankly, not something that is in any way entertaining. Like I said, the fighting is not at all necessary. You could just run past the Cyclobots and move along without consequence. Only the bosses are required fights. However, if you do manage to get into the fighting bits, you'll find that combat to be rather unsatisfying due to the lack of attacks, as well as the lack of any semblance of competent collision detection. Like I said, all the Rangers play the same way, so they have the same punch, kick, jump kick, and a couple combo moves, along with the special abilities you gain along the way. So while it might be fun to try out your favorite Power Rangers in some sad attempt to justify the game's replay value, there's really no point in doing so unless you want a different color suit and another actor telling you to be more careful whenever you run into a hazard. Collision detection also pulls a hearty middle finger to the player when it comes to the game's ill-conceived platforming segments, which are bad enough on their own given the somewhat slippery nature of the controls, but magnified with occasions where you need precision platforming skills. Yeah, have fun with that. Running to fight another day might save you some headaches, but the sloppy platforming is what will kill you more often than not. And you only have a few lives and a few continues before the game ends, and your game save takes this information into account. Unfortunately, you could farm for more lives if you know how, but one wonders if it's really worth the effort. The Zord fights in Time Force aren't all that great, they're rather anemic actually, but at the very least, they're straightforward. It's just you and a monster in a circular arena beating the crap out of each other. No quick time events, no waving joysticks or other stupid gimmicks, just kill the monster and make use of your limited arsenal of attacks, which include 2 slow-moving projectiles. You can control the Time Force Megazord in either red or blue mode, but it depends on the level. You have no real choice over what Zord you get to play with. Later levels do put you in control of the erroneously named Time Shadow Zord. It's actually the Shadow Force Megazord, but I digress. But don't expect that to be some big deal, it plays the same as all the others. Power Rangers Time Force's main story, or campaign as the cool kids like to call it these days, is a strictly single-player affair. But there is a nifty battle mode where 2 players can duke it out. At first you only have the 3 Megazords to play with, but as you progress through the single-player game, you'll eventually unlock playable versions of the boss characters you've just defeated. It's something, I guess, but nothing that hasn't been done better on other games and on other platforms. Game Gear! The graphics in Time Force are alright at best, average fare at worst, teetering somewhere between the thin line of serviceable and less than stellar. You could recognize the Rangers and some of the villains, but the rest of the enemies are generally blurry, almost ugly looking critters. The level design and the set pieces are nothing to brag about, they look the part they're supposed to in the barest sense, but could have also benefited from some cleaner looking textures. Some mild clipping issues along with some awkward camera angles hinder the experience somewhat, but on a whole, it's a visually serviceable presentation if nothing else, nothing really offensive to be found here. At certain points the game will play stock video clips from the show. The clips aren't being shown here for obvious reasons, but I will say that while the video quality is good enough that you could tell what's going on for the most part, there's a good chance that you could get better video quality from old VHS recordings of Time Force from 15 years ago when they aired on Fox Kids. It's barely better quality video than what you'd get on the Power Rangers game that graced the Sega CD. Audio-wise, meh. I guess I could give them credit for getting the actual Time Force cast to provide the voices. Well, most of them anyway. I have no clue who this Aaron Chill person is. But they say very little throughout this entire adventure. I mean, why even bother with them? Most of the dialogue comes from Circuit and some of the big bads like Ranzig or Frax. The performances are consistent with that of the show for whatever it's worth. Actually, they might sound a bit more wooden here, but sound effects are just kinda sorta there. And other than the Time Force theme that plays on the title screen and a couple other instances, your soundtrack comprises fairly paper-cutter orchestral themes that play during the levels. It does provide the game with something of an atmosphere of high adventure, and they're actually pretty decent compositions. If only the game was deserving of such pieces, which I am sad to say, they are not. Power Rangers Time Force on the Sony PlayStation is light years above the anemic dread that is Lightspeed Rescue on Nintendo 64. At the very least, the gameplay is straightforward, the presentation is somewhat competent, there are some side goals to accomplish if you're so inclined, the music's actually decent, and holy shit, you could actually jump. That having been said, do not take this to mean that Time Force is any good, because it really isn't. The combat is meaningless, the collision issues are distressing, the Zord fights, while somewhat playable, are not fantastic, the voice work is lacking, and the replay value is less than 0. Overall, Time Force on the PlayStation is not completely worthless, but outside of the devout Power Rangers enthusiast who has to have every Rangers game out there, this isn't worth the trouble of playing or tracking down. It's quite sad that one of the best Power Rangers game to grace the Sony PlayStation that I've played is the Zeo pinball game, and that's not very encouraging. I'm not even sure I want to even touch the Lightspeed Rescue game now should I ever come across that, as both Time Force and Lightspeed on N64 have pretty much soured me on THQ's console games when it comes to the Power Rangers franchise. The pinball game's alright though, that's probably worth a look.